In the previous lecture, we were discussing mainly the questions raised by the pre-Socratics and their basic answers. We also mentioned the impact and the tremendous influence exercised by Socrates. Socrates, just to recall a few things, briefly was the one who insisted on following things. First of all, knowledge, true knowledge, as the essence of human development and dignity. By knowledge, however, he understood primarily a deep inquisition and vision of moral good. The essential question for Aristotle was how to lead a good life, morally speaking. According to him, therefore, the study of moral good was the most important a man can actually do in life. He also believed that if somebody knows what is morally good, such a person necessarily will do good. In other words, to know what is good is at the same time automatically almost doing the good. In this, perhaps he was somewhat optimistic. In our times, we would say today that this is not necessarily true. But Socrates would insist that if somebody knows something is evil, he will never consciously do evil. And therefore, knowledge of good is fundamental to the very essence of human dignity and the meaning of human life. As we recollect, Socrates is pictured later by his disciple Plato, 427 to 347, by Plato as believer in immortality of the soul. The soul pre-existed the body, into which it is, so to speak, pushed into the material aspect of man, human organism. But it did pre-exist the moment of birth. And in this pre-existence, the soul saw the eternal forms or ideas, in other words, the eidos in Greek, of the one, the true, the beautiful, and so on. Eternal realities. It is debatable whether Socrates himself believed this or whether he is an instrument to express Plato's ideas, taking Socrates as his main speaker. This is a question which doesn't have to be bothering us at this moment. The fact is, however, that the Platonic tradition is characterized by this fact of believing in pre-existence of soul before birth and some sort of vision of the eternal truth, eternal eidos or forms, otherwise also ideas. Those ideas are really real, in contradistinction to seemingly real. We shall briefly explain what is the meaning of the word seemingly real. This distinction between seemingly real and really real is fundamental to ancient philosophy in general and also to any philosophy. So, coming back to Socrates, he was completely convinced that when death comes, death may not be anything that usually people conceive as horrible, evil, something necessarily, unavoidably happening, but against human desires. In former lecture number 3, we were saying that the final words after the trial of Socrates, in which he was sentenced to drink hemlock, where I am going to live, I am going to die, he says, to his accuser, jurors, and judges, you are going to live. However, which is better, God only knows. In other words, there is an echo here of the belief in immortal existence. In general, in Herodotus and Hesiod and the others, former, before Socrates, writers in Greece, the idea of afterlife was already there, was already present. But it was pictured as something very shadowy, very demeaning, very, so to speak, evil even. Not with Socrates, however. And the ideas which Socrates represented are, of course, to a great extent, the ideas by Plato, one of the greatest thinkers of the ancient times. As we recollect, Socrates was sentenced for 1. Introducing foreign gods, 2. Changing what is true into false, in other words, the sum of practicing sophistry of a sort, and 3rd, this corrupting the young generation of people, the students. Although the sentencing was completely unjustified, Socrates did not offer much money for the possibility of being penalized financially, and on second voting he was sentenced to die in prison by drinking hemlock. The ideas and basic concepts which are written down by Plato are essentially written in a form of dialogues. Some of his writings that may perhaps very important, not perhaps but very important writing, the Republic, of course, is another thing. But mainly, the philosophy of Plato was expressed in dialogues. Plato believed also that there is a very essential distinction between sense knowledge, or in other words, what I can see, touch, measure, and intellectual knowledge. Sense knowledge for Plato was only a matter of opinion. True knowledge, episteme in Greek, meant far more. It meant a vision of the eternal truth. And, as already mentioned in former lecture, in the Republic, Book 7, he pictures the famous allegory of the cave, through which he tries to give his convictions, his views on what knowledge really is. Briefly speaking, the people, all human beings, are born in a very semi-dark cave, the universe of sense experiences. And they are chained, foot and hands. They can look only one direction in front of them. They are born in the cave, generation by generation by generation. Therefore, they develop a limited, false vision of reality. To the cave people, what is real is exactly what they can see, imagine, and see in the semi-darkness cave. They cannot change their position. This is important. Because the really real world for Plato is outside the cave. That means the cave people, so to speak, can never see the real world as long as they are chained and fascinated and forced to look one way only in front of them. Behind the cave, there is the real world. There are people walking, animals perhaps, and so on. And still behind them there is big fire, light, and therefore the moving figures outside the cave are throwing shadows on the screen wall, which is observed continuously by the caveman. Naturally, the cave people consider those moving figures and all that's happening on the shadowy screen as real. And they develop all kinds of theories, which figure is saying anything to another, which is moving faster, which is moving slower, and all kinds of, so to speak, explanations of the cave world. The essential thing to remember here is that for Plato, sense experience of the cave people is exactly the opposite of true knowledge. Shadows are not reality. Now, the story goes, the parable says that if we would send somebody to the cave, the people would not believe anything from a strange newcomer from outside, even if he would tell them the truth, that there is a real world, that there is a sun, trees, and so on, behind their backs. They will never believe him. Why? Because such statements would undermine their beliefs from generation to generation. They would consider him dangerous, liar, and perhaps they would finally, if he would be stubborn and insisting, they would take care of him. In other words, they would execute him, accused as perverter of truth, perhaps disorderly revolutionary, danger to society of the caveman, and so on. Something similar, to an extent naturally, happened to Socrates. Because he was teaching his ways of understanding reality, because he revealed to the Athenians their self-deception, showing that most of them have no knowledge at all, although they boast on being very knowledgeable and intelligent people. Socrates, however, truly believed in his views, and therefore he had to die. He made too many enemies. Something like this happened to Christ, for example. Christ was teaching something literally out of this world. And the religious establishment of the times was gradually irritated and perhaps fearsome of his influence. Christ was called all the bad names you can imagine: a perverter, blasphemer, devil, cooperator with evil, and whatnot. He was crucified outside of Jerusalem. It is something of a puzzle, but it seems to be true that people who are original, who go even for very really true ideas, who openly confess those ideas, will be persecuted. It says also something essential about man. Do really people love truth? Or do they prefer to stay in the cave mentality of semi-dark existence? Thinking is, as we said sometime before, difficult. It requires effort, and therefore very many people simply do not face the basic fundamental problems of human life and existence, including problems of cosmology, beginning of the universe, the nature of life, possibility of meaningless or meaningful existence, or immortality after the flesh is dead. But coming back to Plato, so we see that the man who enters the cave is hated. But Plato says, suppose we take forcefully somebody out there. We get him out of the cave. And it is obvious, he says, that from the very beginning, he will not be able to see anything. Why? Because the light of the sun and fire outside of the cave, in the real world, would be hurting his eyes. His eyes were accustomed to darkness of the cave. So it would be very painful for them to for this man, this newcomer from the cave, and he would have to shut his eyes. Only very, very slowly, only very gradually, only step by step, small steps by steps, he will open up. Of course, the eyes are stand here for mental vision, for understanding, for developing through ideas, for reasoning. It is only an allegory. The eyes stand for ability to know ultimate, absolute, eternal truth. This is why Plato developed such a story in the Republic. So Plato believed, as we already mentioned, in immortality of the soul and the eternal forms, the eternal beings. In those beliefs, Plato was influenced by Parmenides, for example, for sure, by Anaxagoras, and by Pythagoras. He naturally knew the others, the ideas, and he was not completely, so to speak, absolutely original. But he was able to put all those ideas, all those visions into a coherent view. This is why the Platonic ideas are still studied very carefully, even in our times. There are two basic insights which Plato developed. The first was the ideas, the theory of the ideas or forms. I repeat, outside of this world, eternal, incorruptible, everlasting, which were models for everything that we can see, touch, and envision here. They are the really real, in contrast to the seemingly real, which is available to senses, to our sense experience. The second basic idea in Plato is the idea of the soul. The soul is first immaterial. The soul is in the body. In a way, it is like dwelling inside the body. And consequently, since it is simple and immaterial, pre-existent, the body, only later being, so to speak, put into the body, the soul is the very center of human nature. For the Greeks in general, the body was more likened to a sort of prison for the soul. Out of those Platonic ideas, later on, during the times of Christianity already, developed the idea of asceticism. The monks and anchorites who practiced very strict ascetic way of living. They neglected completely almost the needs, even the most fundamental needs of the body. The idea even led to some kind of, so to speak, absolute devaluation of whatever is material, bodily, whatever has any, so to speak, attraction or fascination in this world. And they considered it as a call from God. This idea was later on gradually diminished, but it still lingers in some minds, even today. Of course, the Platonic concept of immortal soul as the essential, immortal, eternal, pre-existent inhabitant, so to speak, or dweller in the body, has been assimilated also in Christianity by so-called Christian church fathers, primarily Augustine, later on by Thomas. And the reason is very simple. The idea fits very well with the teaching of Christ, who repeatedly in all Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and later on even in the teaching of Paul, but mainly Christ's teaching, he repeatedly says that whoever believes in him, even if he dies, shall live. The soul is immortal. A man's life here, in a way, is a sort of pilgrimage into eternity, into perpetual eternal life with God. Out of this idea later was developed the idea, very much developed later, idea of hell, idea of heaven, and so on. Plato's thoughts were very apt, so to say, to be assimilated into the Christian vision of the world. I'm not saying that this was in all aspects, or that it was necessary or something like this. I'm simply saying it is a fact that his thoughts seemed to be very much adaptable to the basic concepts of Christianity. Now, the Platonic idea, of course, developed the one genuine thing. Philosophy as such is something that goes far deeper, transcending of the so-called methods of experimental sciences. If Plato would live today, he probably would say that those sciences like biology, archaeology, and so on, evolutionary theories, all those sciences may be profitable in a limited way, but he would probably call the so-called limited scientific view as a remnant from the cave mentality of his allegory in the Republic. The difference between science, experimental science, let's say, and philosophy is, of course, crucial to forever, especially for anyone who is really interested in solving the ultimate, most fundamental problems. Questions: what am I? How come I exist? Is there any meaning to my life? What is happening when I die? Can I expect anything after death? And if, what? Why? All such problems, existence of God and so on, soul, spirit, all such problems are not really within the scope of so-called experimental scientists. For example, a biologist, as an example, let's say a biologist is interested only in one thing: the development, the structure, the origin, and the nature of life and different forms of life. How living things operate. What is really distinguishing a living thing from dead matter? Living things have their own characteristics which are subject to the study of a biologist. In our times, for example, biology is very, very much developing. We have the famous theories of evolution. And there are many who believe that life really is an accidental byproduct only of matter in movement. There is nothing special about life. Life simply is evolutionary process developing through eons of time in very many different forms. Not only that, but the distinction between different species is really not stable, not absolute. Because different forms of life, from more primitive to more developed to more structured, this is what evolution really means. The influence of the book by Charles Darwin. In 1859, he wrote the famous book, now famous, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. This idea has been later developed by other biologists. Very many people believe that life really is an accidental byproduct, that there is nothing special about living forms. Such ideas, of course, are very well placed, if you like, in so-called experimental sciences. Nevertheless, the whole idea of evolution leaves a lot of holes in it. And if you really take care to analyze this whole concept, especially from the very origination of life, then we can see that evolution is by no means the absolute last word in biology. Plato's ideas are very significant for later philosophy, primarily by this stress of philosophical reflection, transcending the thought related to sensibly perceivable objects in everyday existence. And the allegory of the cave expresses this idea very well. Of course, this, what I am saying right now, is only a sketch. There's plenty more to Plato, and it is impossible within those time limits, within one lecture, to give real, perhaps ample and more concise vision of the contribution of Plato to philosophy. But it is important to mention someone whom we shall discuss perhaps in more detail soon in our lectures. This is Aristotle. Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322. Aristotle was an accomplished scientist, as a matter of fact, a biologist, also one of the deepest thinkers ever. Aristotle was the disciple of Plato, and he listened to Plato's thought and theories for almost 20 years. Consequently, he accepted some aspects of Plato's philosophy, but in a very definite way, he opposed Plato too. First of all, the most essential switch here perhaps is in this. According to Aristotle, the forms of things, what later on we would call the whatness of a thing, or the form, the essence, in other words, of what something is in concrete entities in this world known to us. The forms are not some sort of separated eternal realities outside completely of the world, as Plato liked to stress. Aristotle developed a very realistic theory of the general unified vision of the cosmos. This is why Aristotelian philosophy influenced very deeply the Arabic thinkers like Averroes, Avicenna, and others, but also in a very deep way influenced the Western philosophical mentality, the Western philosophies, and philosophers until today. The Aristotelian philosophy was also accepted, gradually pushing out to an extent the Plato's influence, and especially adapted to the Christian vision again was done by Aristotle. The adaptation was done by Aristotle. But Aristotle, of course, was a pagan, and it took several centuries, a number of centuries rather, where he was adapted himself to the Christian vision by the famous Dominican monk Thomas Aquinas. Although the time span between the two is quite long, in a manner of speaking, nevertheless, Thomas Aquinas accepted almost totally, not completely, but almost totally, the philosophy of Aristotle. Aristotelianism became later the philosophy of the Christian Church, Catholic Church especially. For centuries it was considered the only philosophy, the most realistic and the truest, if we can use such a word, philosophy taught in the seminaries, in the Christian environments, for information of priests, bishops, and so on. So Aristotle is a very essential figure in our history, in the history of our philosophical reflection on the West.